Good Thursday morning to you. As we continue the series of Can You Relate, I want to talk about two minor characters in the narration of the scriptures. We've been talking about Jacob and his wives Leah and Rachel. If you have been following along, Jacob loved Rachel and worked 7 years, went into contract with her father Laban, and Laban at the end of the contract actually deceived Jacob, and Jacob ended up marrying the older sister by accident out of deception. That was Leah, and then worked another 7 years so that he could go into contract and marry the younger daughter, the one that he loved more. So we've talked about a little bit about Leah, and we've talked a little bit about Rachel, and now I want to talk about two handmaidens, two servants of Leah and Rachel. This is Zilpah and Bilhah. If you turn to Genesis 30, you will see how they play a role. So when Laban gives his daughter to Jacob to be married, it's not like we have today in our understanding of marriage ceremonies. There's not a lot of long white dresses and reveals at the altar or in wineries or whatever location people choose to get married in nowadays. Instead, what happened was there was some kind of informal ceremony where the bride was covered, and then usually the new husband went into the tent of the new bride and often met the maidservant of that bride on the way into the tent. That's how he knew he was going into the right tent, and then went into the tent, and here's the marriage bed. So when Jacob goes into what he expects to be Rachel's tent, the reason he expects it to be Rachel's tent is because he sees Bilhah. He sees the younger maiden of his wife. What happened is Laban intentionally switched it up, gave the younger maiden to the older daughter and the older maiden to the younger daughter, which is not traditionally how it's done. And so that's how he deceives Jacob. Regardless, Bilhah and Zilpah are sisters as well. They're sisters like Leah and Rachel. And the reality is they're actually probably fathered by Laban. There's a couple different historical references that suggest that Laban purchased their mother from another man because of some dealings that were happening, and then fathered. But because the mother was the second, or the concubine, they had a lesser status in the house. I'm going to encourage you not to get lost in the details of the biblical narrative and how things don't really make sense according to what we know today. Regardless, Zilpah and Bilhah are the maidservants of Rachel and Leah, and they play an incredibly important role in the story of God's people. We know from what we've talked about so far this week that Leah was very fertile. She starts giving birth to all sorts of boys, lots of babies. She has Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah and Issachar and Zebulun. And then she also has a daughter. We know that after Rachel struggled, cried out against God, even blamed her husband a little bit, she is blessed with Joseph. And then later on in the story, she actually dies in childbirth when she gives birth to Benjamin. Now, in the course of those two wives having babies, there was a point when Rachel was jealous of Leah, and then when Leah sees that Rachel is now giving birth, she becomes jealous of Rachel. And so Leah gives her maidservant to Jacob as a secondary wife. Often we refer to them as concubines. And so Zilpah has two sons, Gad and Asher. And as there's a bit of a competition between the sisters as to who can produce more sons according to their lineage, then Rachel gives her maidservant, Bilhah, to Jacob, and they produce Dan and Naphtali. Between these four women, there are 12 sons. This is what will become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now here's the piece that I want to kind of poke at a little bit as we have this series of Can You Relate? Things weren't the way they were supposed to be, right? I mean, like the deception and the jealousy and feeling as if, they had little worth or value. I mean, even the nature of having so many sons, Leah at one point in the narration of Genesis 30 says, at least now I know I will be cared for in my older days because I've produced so many sons. I truly don't believe this is how God designed the world, but it's a reflection of our human brokenness, of how we look at one another. And yet, these 12 sons out of these 4 women become the tribes of Israel, become the continuation of a promise that God makes with Abraham. They become part of the tribes that will be the Israelites, that will settle in the land that was promised to be to God's people. They will have different partitions, and each piece of this land will represent an incredibly important piece in the story of God, even in the expectation of the Messiah. Naphtali is a great example, who comes from Bilhah. The people who walked in darkness, they are the darkness from the land of Naphtali. There's a sense of connection to each one of these tribes, all the way to the messianic promise that is in Jesus Christ. So we may struggle to understand the details of Scripture. We certainly may struggle to understand the details of this story. 4 wives, I can't even imagine having competition with my husband. And I think if you were to ask Chad, he probably would say 1 wife is enough for him. But here's what's cool. Out of our brokenness, out of our limitations, God does amazing things. And God's promise finds a way no matter what. I think about how so easily those women and their sons could have been dismissed or have no value, and yet God found a way to work through the brokenness, the human expectations that had limitations, and God created nations from their offspring. So as you end out this week, as you're looking at your own life, as you're thinking about the struggles you're facing and the frustrations you're enduring, what is God doing with the broken pieces of your life? How is God at work? How is God surprising you? How is God redeeming those qualities about yourself that you hate? Those mistakes that you have made that you just don't know how to let go of? Where is God in that? Because for me, that's why I love these stories. The redeeming power of these stories. The redeeming understanding that it doesn't matter what you and I do. At the end of the day, it only matters what God is doing in and through us. How we are welcoming God, how we are responding to God's grace and mercy. Hope you have a great day.